Hi everybody, this is Della from The Beauty of Play. Today I'm talking about how I'm using our illustration for carbon as an art lesson in our chemistry block. One of the things that was important for me, for my students to know when we were studying chemistry, is that the energy shells that we find electrons are actually spherical in nature. Like, they're not flat. In all the depictions that we see of an atom, they are 2D and flat. Even in my chemistry unit, when we are making a model of an atom, we are using things that give it a 2D dimension, and I wanted to have a better understanding of electron clouds and orbitals and how they work. And so we are using the illustration of carbon for our atomic theory narration as an art lesson to increase our understanding of the spherical nature of electron clouds, and then also use several art concepts that we have gone over in the past few years. We are reviewing several different art concepts here. Some of that is the work that we did from painting and drawing in Waldorf schools in around 6th grade with the drawing of spheres. Some of that is from the watercolor class that we taught and the color theory that we have learned all the way up from wet on wet watercolors through this past year. The last aspect that we're talking about with art is overlapping, to give more depth in the field of view. Before we start this unit, we are using this as review. We're reviewing the science and the atomic theory of protons and neutrons, electrons. We're reviewing electron clouds as far as energy shells and orbitals, and we're also reviewing the charges, quarks, bonding, and other elements of atomic theory. At the same time, we're also reviewing all of the concepts that we talked about before in art, and we are practicing making our spheres before we start drawing our carbon atom. For this video, I'm going to focus in on how I'm using this illustration for science as an art lesson. So I'm going to focus in on the art portion of this. The very first thing that we do is have a conversation with review. We've already gone over the science, and so we're going to talk about here complementary colors, adjacent colors, contrast. We're going to discuss what a sphere looks like. We're even taking some time to look at a sphere, how the light hits a sphere in different directions. Like if we move the sphere in one position where the light is hitting directly on, where do we see the shadows? Where do we see the highlights? If we move it so that the light is coming from the right, again, where do we see the shadows? Where do we see the highlights? At this point, we're then going to start practicing drawing spheres. First, we're determining where our light source is, and then we're using the broadside of chalk pastel to form a circle, not an outline and then coloring in, but to form the circle with movement of the broadside of the chalk. From here, we're going in with our fingers and smoothing out. This is not something that has to be done, but I feel like this gives it a little more depth. And then after we have it smoothed with our circles, we're going to go back in and add a little more color for the shadow, the darkening. So you can see that there is a darkening shadow on the outer edges and the bottom left of this sphere because the light is coming from behind us on the top right. From here, I've decided that I want to use an adjacent color for shadow, so I'm taking an orange and placing that in the darkest part of my sphere, which is on the lower left-hand segment of the sphere, and then just a little bit to the opposite of that. So using this orange color to add in a shadow for the sphere when we're doing the atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, and the electron shells, we will not be doing that shadow because this is depicted in space. The practice of the spheres is done several times, not just once. So we're choosing several different colors, maybe even several different directions of the light, and we're practicing several spheres before we go on to draw our atom in our notebook. Two things that are going to bring depth to our illustration of our atom are overlapping. If we're looking at a bundle of protons and neutrons, we're not going to be able to see every single particle. So we're going to use overlapping, and then shadow or highlights. We're focusing in on shadows here and the highlights by not coloring in as deeply the entire section. There are probably several different ways to do highlights. The two that I am most familiar with is choosing an adjacent color or choosing a complementary color, and I want to take a few minutes to show you what that looks like. The drawing of this green sphere, I've chosen an adjacent color to green, blue on the color wheel, and I'm using that to create my deeper shadows. So I'm putting it on the bottom left portion of the circle and then a little bit on the opposite side of that circle to give a deeper shadow effect. For this second sphere that I'm drawing, still green, I'm going to choose a complementary color to add for the shadows. The complementary color, which is the opposite of the color wheel for green, is a red. Complementary colors, when mixed together, create neutrals, so browns, beiges, grays, and that is what we're doing when we add a complementary color as a shadow in this sphere. I'm placing it in the same position that I did with the other circle, but you can see the difference here. That circle is more muted in color and the other is bright. There's no real right or wrong in choosing colors for your shadows. It's more of a stylistic choice. Do you want a brighter object or do you want a more realistic, muted, colored object? Here are the two of them side by side so you can see the difference. Another aspect of this drawing that is slightly different than other drawings is that we are drawing spheres within spheres, but we want these to be translucent enough that we can see inside of them. So in addition to drawing and practicing the spheres, we're also going to be practicing drawing spheres within spheres. After our practice is finished, we're now having a conversation about what colors we're going to choose for our drawing. One of the things that I wanted for this particular drawing is for everything to be color-coded. So the protons are going to be one color, neutrons another color. Each energy shell will be its own color, and the electrons will be another color. At this point, we're also talking about what colors we're going to use for highlights and lowlights. I have chosen blue as my protons, orange as my neutrons. On the blue, I am using purple, which is an adjacent color on the color wheel, for my shadows, and I am using red for my shadow on the orange. I'm also using a little bit of yellow for my highlights in my orange neutrons. After that is drawn, I am drawing my first energy shell. The color for my first energy shell that I have chosen is a pink. I needed the energy shells to be a lighter color than the protons and neutrons because this is semi-transparent and we want to be able to see through to see our nucleus. So our electron clouds are going to be lighter in color, and we're going to be lighter in drawing them as well. The concept of drawing the sphere is still the same. I'm using the broad side of my chalk pastel, and I'm going in lightly and forming my sphere, making the outside edges a little darker for my shadows and lightening as I go in to the point where the highlight is, which I've intentionally placed around the view of our nucleus, so that it's easier to see our nucleus within the electron shell. When I want a more defined edge, I will either press on the outside of the chalk or go in with the corner and draw a line along the edge to define the area that I'm looking to define in my sphere. Slightly different than my protons and my neutrons as far as shadow color and choosing adjacent color. I have chosen a darker hue, a red, for the shadow of the first energy shell. Now I'm starting the last electron cloud energy shell. I'm basically drawing a concentric circle around the first energy shell with, again, the broad side of an orange pastel. I'm being very intentional in drawing this shell because, again, I want it to be translucent. So I'm starting out very light along the outside, working my way gently to the inside. There is some overlapping. You can see I start to overlap here on the pink, but I'm going very lightly and coming back in and darkening it up as I go so that I'm not losing that translucent quality of these shells. Added several layers of the orange pastel, almost like washes. So I'm going through with the pastel and going around the edges, and then I'm gently going back with my fingers and smoothing things out, and then going again with the pastels along the edges and smoothing things out so that I'm able to keep that transparency in my energy shells. Also chosen an adjacent color red for this orange for the shadow, and you can see I'm going in with the red and gently layering a little bit of chalk and then smoothing it out with my fingers. At this point, I'm looking at my drawing, seeing if it needs anything extra. I'm noticing that I kind of lost some of the dimension of the first energy shell, so I am going back and increasing the pink along the edges of that. Now I'm deciding where to put my electrons in my energy shells. We are doing this anatomically correctly, so we're putting 2 electrons in the first energy shell and 4 electrons in the outside shell. These are a little harder to give dimension to, so what I'm doing is taking a little bit of light green and making a circle, and then adding a tiny bit of dark green along the outside, and then coming in with a little yellow to highlight that center. An aspect of the electrons and the electron shells to the protons and the neutrons that I wanted to try to depict, which can't fully be done because the scale is just enormous, is the difference in size between an electron and the nucleus, because protons and neutrons have mass, but an electron is considered a point particle with no mass at all. So in comparison to a proton and neutron, an electron is tiny small, and the vast majority of an atom is space between the neutron and the electron clouds. That's all for today. I hope this was helpful as to how I incorporate an art lesson into our science for review of both art and science. Until next time, happy homeschooling.